struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're prouder, too strong. The worst is over. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the AZAPO Online Political Education Series. And today, the 4th of April, 2021, excuse me, I'm playing host to Professor Rothney S Tshaka, a comrade of the Black Consciousness Movement. We are discussing the resurrection of blackness from the dead, and welcome Professor Tshaka.
Thank you, Tawa.
Just a bit of introduction about him. Professor Rothney S Tshaka was born in a small township on the extreme outskirts of Ritchie, what others call Kimberley. The township is called Ritchie. He completed his schooling at the local Kgabang combined school in Ritchie, after which he then headed off to the University of the Western Cape in 1997. And that's where he read for a degree in theology. So he left the University of the Western Cape with a Bachelor of Theology and joined the University of Stellenbosch. And that's where he read for the Master of Divinity, which he obtained cum laude. He then went on to also read for the Licentiate in Theology at the same University of Stellenbosch. He then left the University of Stellenbosch for the Free University of Amsterdam, where he obtained his Master of Theology. He came back to the University of Stellenbosch to study for his PhD. He is an alumna of Columbia Theological Seminary in the town or the county of Decatur in Georgia. He has taught Theology and Ethics at the Murray Theological College in Zimbabwe. He was an associate professor of ethics and community at the new Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Jersey in the USA. He was also the chair of the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology, and is currently the director of School of Humanities in the College of Human Sciences at the University of South Africa. He is also an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Uniting Reformed Church of Southern Africa, or in Southern Africa. He is one of the founding conveners, excuse me, for the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race, as well as editorial board member of Black Theology and International Journal. His current research work and interests are in the fields of Black and African studies, Reformed theology, Black and African theologies, and critical race theories. He is a recipient of numerous scholarly awards, including the UNISA Chancellor's Award for Research, and was awarded a C2 rating by the National Research Foundation. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on the intersections of theology, race, and politics. Those of you who were at AZASCO at some stage would also know that he was the chairperson of the UWC branch in 1998. Welcome once more, Comrade Rothney, and we look forward to a conversation with you this afternoon. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, the conversation is really about the resurrection of blackness from the dead, and I really look forward to you unpacking this, for us and telling us what exactly it means and how we should understand, this concept of resurrection of blackness from the dead. and we really look forward to your input. So we will give you an opportunity to share your thoughts and perspectives with us for the next half hour to 45 minutes, and then thereafter we will interact with you, and the floor is yours.
Good. Thank you once again, my tower.
Yeah, welcome.
All righty.
It's going to be an interesting discussion, I can imagine.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. These are things that I am quite passionate about, but I'm actually looking forward to the conversation that I hope these few notes can lead to. Yeah. So I want to also thank you really for allowing me to come and speak on a subject, also particularly on this day, a day that in the Christian calendar has become quite significant. But also want to speak to these things because I think it is very important, Tower, for us to sort of just think about the fact that we seem to have given up our own responsibility of searching very closely the significance of certain things and applying that to our own context. I think we don't do enough, in my opinion, to check that what we appropriate for ourselves is indeed something that we understand their origins, but that we're able also to inflect and also to criticize when we apply them in our own context. You'll let me know when I should start and maybe just share some of these issues before we get to the point where we.
No. The floor is yours. You can.
All right. All right. Now, once again, let me thank you and let me thank the organization for allowing me this platform to come and just talk to you about what could be perceived as a rather peculiar subject. Peculiar because we Black people tend not to want to, mess up, if you will, what is the established things. And so when you think of the word, the resurrection of blackness from the dead, to many, of the faint-hearted, that could be perceived as rather very controversial. But I would like to start off by just maybe speaking to the notions that I'm using as part of my title here. So when I think of resurrection, I think, in other words, of the rebirth. I think of notions such as wokeness. I think of consciousness. And of course, I think I'm just opening up for many people to get a sense of what I think when I look at the word resurrection. And when I think of blackness, for instance, I think of blackness not removed from the particular material conditions that Black folk find themselves in. I was quite exasperated when I once saw a book by Angie Kroch titled "Begging to be Black," and it was problematic to me because it is once again an example of how whiteness tend to just want to impose itself, onto the Black situation, as if you can just wear a garment, a Black garment, and therefore say, by virtue of having worn this garment, I'm therefore Black. And it reminds me also at the same time to a conversation that Dick Gregory, one of the civil rights activists in the US, once started when two of his grandchildren came to him and were complaining that one has messed up his sandcastle. Of course, these boys were playing along the beach, and one had built a sandcastle, and one was just, one broke it. And so when he set them down, he said to him, it's one thing when you imagine that this sandcastle is your house. It's a whole different thing when that becomes your address. And so Black people or white people have got a tendency of simply saying they associate with Black people, when in fact it is not their address. Because when the whole historical baggage comes, then you realize that that is not the address, and therefore they cannot be Black. So Blackness for me is more than just wearing a garment and say I'm Black. It is also taking into account historical baggages that had put Black people in a particular position. So we get excited many times as Black folk when white people speak our language and we baptize them as Black. But we must understand that you can only be Black if you call Blackness your address, if that is where you stay, if that is where all the problems come and visit you. And when we think of that, of course, I think it's something that we all understand as nothingness. So when you think of resurrection, on the one hand, you also have to think of death on the other hand. And so death means a position of being marginalized, a position of nothingness, which is where Black people for the longest time have been resigned to. I mean, we've been read out of major narratives, our cosmologies and our ways of contributing to knowledge production has never been taken seriously. So when we speak of resurrection, we speak about a deliberate, and I want to underline the word, a deliberate attempt at speaking life to Black people, a deliberate attempt of reading Black history, of making sure that our lived experiences frame the conversations that we have. So I just thought it's very important that we think of that. And so that we're having this conversation on the so-called holy time could also for others mean, but you're really making a mockery of this. But I think it's important that we go back again to the whole notion of Easter, just before we get into this issue. So you might ask yourself maybe, why is it that the Easter is never celebrated the same time? I mean, if I were to commemorate someone's death or someone's birth, I would know exactly when the date is, and I would do that every year the same time. But why is it that every year we have or we celebrate Easter on different periods? And the reason simply is because we have to think of Easter in this way. One, or rather the celebration of the resurrection of Christ in this way. One, think of the council that was called by Constantine in AD 325, where he had actually asked for a conversation on the full divinity of Christ, as well as the full humanity of Christ. So it was also in that meeting that a debate was raised there for us to then, if we're going to think about the birth and the death of Christ, when are we going to celebrate these things? So the idea of celebrating Easter at this time is because if you look at the vernal equinox, that is when the sun is directly on the equator, which then means that the length of the days and the length of the night are very equal, therefore. And this is important for people in the northern hemisphere because for them, it signals, therefore, the start of spring. And spring is important in the sense that you have now new life springing forward, you have flowers blossoming, and so the idea of life is therefore associated with spring. And so just like the idea of resurrection, of course, which is actually the idea of life, is associated with this time. So the notion of where it was linked, therefore, to Easter is a bone of contention, which was not addressed until the 8th century, when one of the church fathers, Bede, was of the view that it refers to an Anglo-Saxon goddess called Easter, who was a goddess of spring and fertility. And that's where the whole idea of the Easter bunny comes in, the whole Easter, because it speaks to fertility, it speaks to new life. And these things, unfortunately, we have appropriated themselves for us as a Christian community without really asking the origins thereof. I'm pointing this out deliberately because there's a tendency among us as Black folk to want to assume that the Christian faith as we have come to know it is pure. And we actually want to try very hard to preserve that pureness. But if you look at the histories of these important events in the Christian calendar, you will realize that indeed this is a combination of pre-Christian traditions that has worked themselves into the Christian tradition. And the same can also be applied to Christmas, for instance, but that's, I suppose, a conversation for another time. And so now that I have said something about the title, I want to just take us back briefly to the whole origin of Black theology of liberation. We know, of course, that Black theology of liberation started in the USA. It was, of course, championed by the likes of James Cone, who were actually responding to a wide racist context. In fact, if you think of Black theology of liberation, you cannot think about it without thinking about the Black power statement, which was popularized by Kwame Ture, but also it was a notion that was used by Clayton Powell Jr. already earlier, before it was popularized by Kwame Ture. But we see in the origin of Black theology in the US that it originates not from among academics or so-called scholars, but that it originates from a Black clergy who are still affiliated with the white church and were trying very hard to ask, or rather to beg for integration into these white structures. And I think it's important that I just say this again. In the context of the USA, when we think of the origins of Black theology in the USA, it was originated by Black radical clergy who at that time were trying to ask for integration in white established churches. And of course, Cone and Geirut Wilmore would say to you that there are at least 3 phases of the origins of Black theology in that context. And the second phase, of course, is whereby you see now some scholars also contributing to that. But I think it's important also that we mention the fact that many of the radical Black clergy did not anticipate that the presence of whites in their business would bring it down in the way that they have done. But we see also, in my opinion, we see relationships, we see similarities between the origin of Black theology in the USA and that of in South Africa, whereby you have in your midst of this, white folk and the trajectory that this tends to take at the later stage. I'm firmly of the view that, and I've seen that this happening many times, that white presence in our business just changed the dynamics of conversations. I mean, in South Africa, for instance, here, when you speak of the late 60s, when you had the arrival of Black theology of liberation through the University Christian movement in South Africa, of course, led by or necessitated by the likes of Basil Moore, that from the onset you had white people involved in this. It is not by chance, therefore, in my opinion, that you have nothing of it really today, because it changes the dynamics of conversations, whether we like it or not. And I'm not saying this. I don't really feel the need to apologize about it, but I want to say it in a way that people understand it very clearly. The presence of whites in our conversations meant to ameliorate Black situations changes the dynamics, because when you speak with only Black brothers and sisters, you get a different outcome than when you speak with Black and white brothers and sisters. Now, I think in the context of South Africa, this has been made even more problematic because of this so-called non-racialism, which is very problematic in my opinion, because it simply says, if you are not going to speak for whiteness, then I'm not going to speak for Blackness. But we need to understand that white people don't need to name their things white anymore. They don't need to name them white anymore. They can simply do their stuff without even putting a marker on it. But for us Black people who are still trying to really organize ourselves, it is very important that we have markers that are intentional in what it is that we want to address in some of these conversations. So that has to do with the issue really of Black theology in this country, and why, in my opinion, it has failed to percolate Black communities. I'm hoping I have some of my I have some Black theologians also in this conversation so that they can push back. I'm strongly of the view that Black theology of liberation has failed to percolate Black communities, and the reasons are varied. But one of them is, of course, the fact that Black theology of liberation has never thought it necessary to take African cultures as an important ingredient in their reflections. So what I mean is, you find that Black theology is simply a request or a begging to be included into the political arrangement of the day. That's why it speaks to that. But it does not intentionally say, let us think about African culture, for instance. And this is one of the reasons why we have had such a great criticism from our West and East African counterparts who were questioning a kind of theology that is not seeing itself bigger than simply asking for political inclusion into the establishment. By deliberately saying we have not always been been subjects of whites, but we also, as Africans, have got particular histories where it was more than simply the political, and this you see also happening, and I try to use the USA and South Africa because this is basically where Black theology of liberation is seen as having a lot of similarities and, of course, a few dissimilarities. In the case of the USA, I have indicated that the presence of whites in the first phase of radical Black theology was something that many radical Blacks did not anticipate, and it has messed it up. The second thing was that you would take then some of these radical people and bring them into the church bureaucracies, which means instead of having a breakaway, you would then quiet them by putting them in key bureaucratic positions of the Black church, not rather of the Black church, but of the white established church of which these Black radicals were part and parcel of. You can see the same kind of thing in South Africa. Post 1994, you don't see Black theologians or students of Black theology of liberation once again pushing this agenda as they used to do it before that. And that is because if you look at where they are located, they are taken up into the establishment. What people call the hiring out from the leadership of the movements, taking them into these positions, and therefore leaving nothing for this leadership to build on for generations to come. And this is also basically how Black theology of South Africa has sort of dissipated here. In 1999, there was the multi-event that was organized by the University of Cape Town. And in that multi-event, you already hear many people speaking about how moribund Black theology has become, because now suddenly we're in this new South Africa, and so there's no need to speak of Black theology. But for me, this is not a surprise at all, because you have always have this inclination of white people who want to speak for Black people, to tell us when we're supposed to stop thinking about certain things, and when we're supposed to start now to get with the reality. And then you see the birth of what they call constructive theology by the likes of Villavicencio and others, moving away from a language that others felt make them uncomfortable, and rather getting a careful language that people can therefore say we are all together in this. But this is something that you see consistently throughout history, that we are moving away from Black because it makes certain people uncomfortable, and so we're going to adopt a language that embraces everyone. Now, the problem has never really been the issue of humanity. For instance, many people speak about the fact that we are all human, and the language of human rights seem to be thrown into any discussion like a cat among pigeons. But I think it's important that I just refer you to some of one guy that, in my opinion, has helped me really to clearly understand what is at play here. There is a this week he just turned 88. Kofi Asare-Opugo is a scholar of African traditions in Ghana, and has really helped me to look beyond what we are seeing. For instance, when we think of the word, of the notion West, the West, he defines it, and he says the following, that it is very difficult to give a precise definition to the term the West or Western, since those who apply it to themselves use it to connote a variety of ideas ranging from European, white, Christian, capitalist, democratic, progressive, modern, and even human. All these notions, however, imprecise, have crystallized into a consciousness which understands itself to be different from all others and views itself as the standard of value. So I find that we by not going back to our own worldviews as Africans, by stopping at the point of agitating for political inclusion, we shoot ourselves in the foot, because then the impression is given that we have always been slaves only. And yet when we speak of Africa and African worldviews, we then realize that we have not always been slaves. And so it is actually not worth it to change ourselves. But by saying we should not stop at political inclusion, I am not at all saying we should give that up. I'm saying rather what is needed is a multi-pronged approach to how we really rebirth, or how we really give velocity to the issue of the resurrection of black folk. By saying that I have not always been subjugated, does not mean that I should not engage the hegemonies that subsequently put me in a position that I am. But it also asks that I look beyond that. And maybe this is the reason why we don't look beyond that, is because of our own South African history, Tawa. I think it's very problematic that if we are to think about our own history, we don't seem to be able to go far back. But this is exactly how hegemonists move. They make sure that they eviscerate all your history. They wipe away all your heroes. All traces of you having a relationship with the divine is getting rid of, so that you become yourself the spokesperson for the hegemonies. I think one of the reasons why Black people get so upset with any talk about Africanization is precisely because they have got not much information about themselves, and that's why they become the spokespeople for the very hegemonies that keep them in the position of servanthood that they find themselves in. So still on the subject of why Black theology has never percolated Black communities in South Africa, it is also important that we must realize that a Black theology has to be a theology of a Black church. Black theology must be a theology of a Black church. Now, in the South Africa that we find ourselves living, I am of the view that we don't, and I'm speaking from the point of view of the mainland church traditions. I'm going to say something a little bit about that. But in as far as I am concerned, we have got no Black church in South Africa, in the mainland. There's none of that. So we might be Black in these churches, but it's not our churches, because the liturgies, the theologies, all of this might be translated into the vernacular, but these are not resources that emanate from the people, that come from the people. These are all things that were imposed onto us, and we had translated that. And the problem with translations is that sometimes it masks the truth. Now I want because I realize that our time is moving. Let me make this an example, and this was actually something that was made aware to me by my friend who sadly lost not so long ago, Professor Vueni Velem, who was reminding us of what has become a very important hymn in many of our churches, the so-called Siyakudumisa. I don't know, Tawa, if you know that hymn.
I do, actually.
Yeah. So you see the problem with the Dion Laudumas, which was translated into isiXhosa as Siyakudumisa, is actually a doxology of Vasco da Gama's violent seizure of the city of Kilwa in Tanzania. So when you hear Black people sing Siyakudumisa, and for me, I'm trying to impress the point of how important context is, how important it is that we should not uncritically assert Eurocentric positionalities. We should not just take them as they are. Because when we take some time and sort of take some layers of them, we'll realize that these things actually are perpetuating the ideas of conquest. And yet they have found place into our liturgies. Kwesi Dixon of Ghana, right, for instance, in his Theology in Africa, he says, merely eliminating the Western cultural attachments could still leave the church in Africa with a Christ who wears an unauthentic countenance. It is important to be able to identify those cultural elements from the West that came with Christianity as it has been presented. But the indigenization or Africanization policy that proceeds solely along these lines to the exclusion of all other possible approaches assumes quite wrongly that there can be a proclamation of the gospel that does not have a cultural particularity. So this is the problem. I mean, look at the songs that we are singing. Look at the liturgies. I mean, that you are able to read them or to sing them in isiXhosa or isiXhosa, does not mean that they really originate from that. And sometimes these things are doxologies, as I've just said. That sort of just, once again, thank God for the conquest that they had on the African people. I mean, another example would be the Setswana Bible, for instance, translated by Robert Moffat, that takes the very notions that our people are comfortable with, Mudimu, Badimu, and then gives the impression that this new church tradition has the same God, Mudimu, and yet the notions that we are comfortable with, like what Badimu, is then bastardized to mean something other than what it originally meant for people. So again, the question of what is the political role that translations speak, and can we be comfortable by merely translating these things into the languages that our people speak without questioning the motivations behind them? So I've just said that we don't have there are no Black people in the Black churches because we don't have a theology that is ours. What we have is a theology that is imposed. And the biggest problem, the issue here is that Black theologians or Black people in the mainland churches, furthermore, see themselves as a little bit privileged, a little bit better than those who originate from the so-called Zionist movements. Let me say that again. We as Black people in the mainland churches tend to look ourselves as a little bit privileged, better off than the masters, those ones who we consider to have no theological education and who are, in our own view, are the most backward ones. I mean, I sometimes listen to how we speak about these Christians, which is actually a very sad thing, because I think if Black theology had stopped to be so obsessed with political inclusion, both in society and also in academia, we could have really done much more had we taken our brethren from the African traditional religions as conversational partners to have some of these issues. I mean, it's very sad that we have not done that much to really take them as conversational partners and to speak about issues that really gang up on the Black communities. We have not done so. Another problem is today you have seen how drones, who pretend to be pastors of the Christian tradition are abusing our members. And I think had Black Theology of Liberation played again a role of seeing them as conversational partners instead of finding ways to be included, in academic and in societies, perhaps we would not have some of the problems that we are having today. So I think that the first thing that we need to say going forward is that we need to ask for a Black church that is going to give birth to a theology that is therefore going to be able to sustain us in dealing some of the issues that we are looking at. I don't know how is my time, Tower.
No, you can move towards your conclusions, fine.
Yes, I'm going to move towards my conclusion. So the last thing really that I want to say is that I think there is a lot that we need to do as Black folk. And I think these are not things that are going to come to us, but these are things that we have to intentionally work towards getting them. I am reminded of words that were shared by an owner of slaves, a slaves owner, Willie Lynch, in the 1700s, when he was invited to come and share some of his tricks of really keeping slaves in their place. And so he's also known to have argued that the inflation of differences among slaves is very important to keep Blacks in their place. So he argued that on top of his list is age, but only because it starts with an A. The second, he says, is color or shade. There is intelligence, size, sex, size of plantation, status of plantation, attitude of owners, whether the slaves live in a valley or on a hill, have fair hair, coarse hair, or is tall or short. Now that you have a list of differences, I shall assure you that distrust is stronger than trust and envy stronger than adulation, respect, or admiration. The Black slaves, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry on and will continue self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands. The Black slaves, after receiving this indoctrination, shall carry on and will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands. Now, you see, this is a problem with us Black folk, that we tend to highlight differences among ourselves, which are rather marginal, at the expense of that which can really propel us forward, which is our Black unity. And this is one of the reasons where you find Black folk as that only nation that does not seem to get this thing right. Because we don't have a sense of saying what is not so important, which we can tolerate in the interest of a more important agenda. Now, I think it is important that we as Black folk start to contract, have a covenant with Black South Africa. And when we have a covenant with someone, you of course have to be careful that you're going to keep your word. And so the biggest problem I find is that we, the so-called educated ones, are part of this problem. Because you see, we have been captured by the matrices of power. Now, whether we like it or not, we are part of the system, whether we are workers or whether we are owners of the castle. And I think it is very important that if we start this conversation on behalf of the hoi polloi, that we need to have some disclaimers that speak to the fact that we are not always faithful to the agenda that is meant to ameliorate the situation of Black folk. So I'm saying this Black theology needs to stop doing theology for the sake of white people, but for ourselves. And that means that there's a number of things that we must do. We must start to covenant with one another. We must start to be self-critical of what this education does to us as Black folk and how it brings about a disjuncture between us and the very communities that we're supposed to help. I mean, why is it so impossible that you, Tower, cannot get into one room. The best black minds, those with some money, and so on and so forth. I say it's difficult because we have been captured by the matrices of power. Most of these black folk have this money, but actually you realize that it is not their monies. They are like what Farrakhan speak about, the mannequins in the shopping mall of democracy. A mannequin, it has what you want to buy, but the mannequin cannot talk, it cannot act, it cannot do nothing. And this is a problem with our best minds, because we want the accolades, we want all the nice things that come with academic scholarship, and we rather satisfy that. And so this is not different from hiring out from the leadership of the masses. By taking Tshaka, giving him a very key position, and reminding him from time to time that, listen, Chief, you are here for a particular responsibility and nothing else. And that's why we are so quick to no more wanting to be associated with organizations such as AZAPO, because now we have to serve everyone. It's problematic. It's a lie at its best, and it is a lie that is refuted by this non-racialism nonsense that we have come to lift up to all detriment. So I would like to park having said that, but I'm hoping that I have said enough things that would allow us to have a conversation going forward. With those words, thank you, my Tower.
Thank you, Comrade Tshaka, and quite a profound contribution there. And those of you who are in mainland churches will say you were very controversial this afternoon. But those of us who tend to listen more to the said and the unsaid will say different. I think the beginning of the conversation is really about understanding, what we mean by blackness, and it speaks to the totality of the Black condition, the totality of who we are as Black people. And if it means that, then the resurrection would be to bring life to that understanding of that totality of condition. And why is it then that it is so difficult for the Black church, which you claim not to exist, that it cannot breathe life to the congregants, such that they understand the totality of their condition, and that the heaven that they aspire to go to is not elsewhere but where they are, and that it needs to be resolved by the present living inhabitants of society. Maybe that's where we should start this conversation.
Yes. Tao, I think that's a significant question. If at all this is a subject, the questions that we're raising is, why is it that we find as a Black church we are not able to Ubiko speaks about the Black man being a shell of a human being, and that Black consciousness is a means to pump life back into that shell of a human being. And I think my response is in the fact that we might be Black, me and you, members of the church, but we there's no Black church in South Africa. The mainland church it's not Black. Why is it? And I referred to issues of the theological education, where we study. What are the issues that we study? Today the struggle is over the curriculum. What you put into the curriculum determines the product at the end of the day. And that's why I'm saying we're not Black, there's no Black church, because we don't have a theology. There's no Black theology. I mean, at UNISA, for instance, some of the things that keep me busy for a great part of my work is to look at how do we transform the curriculum today. And you find that if you bring in some of this radical stuff, the system in South Africa through the Council of Higher Education, for instance, would ask someone at Stellenbosch who doesn't agree with how you want to change your offering. And based on that, so we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place. The best response is that we try to find a way to get out of this relationship, that we get out of this situation where when we speak about a Black church, it is because the ones that frame the agenda of this church are the very people of that community. I mean, to be told that I must still try to perfect studies on Karl Barth in today, for you to get a PhD. By the way, I did my PhD in Karl Barth, and of course, I make an example of myself most of the time with that the system keeps you busy with things that has got nothing to do with how you can change and transform your community. By dropping a book from time to time and say, read some more on the subject. But once you begin to look into yourself, tap into your own wells of knowledge, look into the narratives of these grannies who are great church members, but at the same time, there's not one time that they don't do what the ancestors expect of them to do. And you begin to take this seriously instead of looking down on them. Then you realize that you set yourself on a course that no one can sort of give you more books on that subject. So a Black theology, a Black church is one that says, how do we make sense of God and Jesus Christ in this Black situation?
Very true. How do we make sense of God in this situation? And, 2 days ago, a lot of people were speaking of the Jesus of Nazareth. Yes. And not the Jesus of Ritchie, not the Jesus of, Tshwane, but it's the Jesus of Nazareth. And, everything is postponed, and it's the Jesus of Israel. I think that is where the problem begins. How do we relate to Jesus, and how should we be relating to Jesus, understanding his teachings and understanding how, he speaks to us? How should he be speaking to us in such a way that we understand him the way we ought to be understanding him? Yes. Maybe that's the thing that you need to help us with, so that we can have an appreciation of the kind of Jesus that we're preaching to as Black people, in such a way that Black church which you claim doesn't exist, to exist. What needs to be done for the existence of the Black church? Yes. Maybe as you engage with that, and maybe help us, because if we listened carefully to your contribution, there is a sense in which one would say you conflate the region that Black people subscribe to, to what some call Black or African spirituality. Yes.
Actually, I think I'm very happy that you have seen that. Basically, what I would like, and I'm starting to respond to the last part of your question only. What I'm actually trying to present rather is that there ought to be a fusion between Black theology and African theology. There ought to be because Black theology, and as far as I have explained, has to do to a great extent with political inclusion into the status quo. While African theology says that there are worldviews that we have to sort of foreground in this conversation. But remember, we find ourselves in a context where it is no more white people who look down on African worldviews, but it is Black people themselves. Yeah. Such that so that agenda has been so successful that white people can sit back and relax while they see how we get at one another, trying to protect something that we think you are making impure by suggesting that it has to have a close affinity and relationship with African worldviews. And that is because we have written African worldviews off as backward, as barbaric, as dirty, and so on and so forth. And this is also when I bring to the other point that you're raising, this is also one of the reasons why when we celebrate the Easter in South Africa, some people will go to an extent of even hiring a white person who sort of represents to them this Christ. So there is that flight from the Black self, not wanting to be associated with anything Black. And so we don't believe that our salvation can come from ourselves. It must certainly come from someone else who doesn't look like us. That's why we even buy kinds of dolls that don't look like us. We buy white dolls and so on and so forth, because we have resigned ourselves to the belief that we can only be saved by someone who doesn't look like ourselves. So a Black theology, that's why I keep on saying, a Black theology is one that says it must come from the people. Now, many people get offended when I speak like this, but the whole question of Jesus being a white person is also political.
It is.
It's very political. So no one questions that. I wrote an article 2 years ago titled, "If the color of Jesus is not an issue, why are you so incensed at the suggestion that Jesus is black?" You see, so people say, no, but it's not about color. But once you suggest that we are going to have a picture of a Jesus that is black, I'm telling you, my brother, the sort of backslash that you're going to get from black people in that congregation is problematic. In one of the congregations that I went to an extent of asking that we take off these white pictures of Jesus because they are not a true historical fact, you know. So we will have to. The issue of contracting with black folk means that we need to find the space and the time to tell ourselves these issues. I am very careful about where I criticize black folk because I don't want to be a reference for white folk. But I think once we start to covenant with black folk, it gives us latitude and it gives us mileage to speak to the issues that have become problematic for us. Yeah. So that would be my response to that. We need to find a way of contracting and covenanting with black folks so that we can tell one another. And remember, as they said, this truth must be introduced bit by bit to the black folk so that they don't dismiss you outright. You have to find ways of when do you put some of these truths in?
That's the thing. And I'm really worried about that as to how do we ensure that, the message and the language permeates through the black folk without them throwing you out of their church.
Yes. Yes.
Now, but certainly they will do that. Can you really say that black theology left us hanging, after the advent of the so-called new dispensation? And some would say it failed to evolve and does not see itself being relevant in the current religious setup. Would you agree with that? That others would see black theology as having been, conceptualized as a theology that fights white domination, and therefore, post 1994, there is no need to fight white domination because we are this rainbow nation. I'm not too sure why would people think that white domination ended with 1994, but for some reason we have seen the predominance of black theology before 1994 disappearing into thin air, and yet the church is filled in the main by black people in this country.
Sure. So it's actually for me a very sad when we think about this. Because you see, I have mentioned here the multi-event of 1999, which was meant really to bring sectors together so that they can chart a way forward. And already then you hear white people beginning to say black theologians become moribund because we are now in a different dispensation. You hear people speaking about the death of black theology. Now, I always say, but I was not invited to this funeral, so I don't understand why white people, of all people, would speak of the death of black theology. But I said also that this does not surprise me because remember, there's always that perception that whites are the perpetual teachers and blacks are the perpetual students. So they feel the need to tell us when we must stop thinking about these issues, and that's why they then construct new and so-called embracing notions, like I mentioned, constructive theology. There's another one which is now the more popular one called public theology, and this is just because people are uncomfortable with the word black. They're uncomfortable with the word black. For some people, it excludes them, and I also said that, you see, unfortunately, the difference between black and white is that white people don't have to name their things white. They don't have to do that. They can just have something, and then when you enter that, you will realize that this is white without it saying it is white. But yet we as black folk, unfortunately, we are kept busy by nonsensical issues that we don't even see the need to really organize ourselves in a way that is really going to speak to this issue. The second point is, indeed, black theology Black theology has left us hanging because, as I've said, the leaders of Black theology of yesteryear were all taken up into this very interesting positions. The hiring out from the leadership of the masses. I mean, look at these people. You know, you speak of the Boosters, you speak of the Tutus, you mention them. All of these people, then even our past president of AZAPO, who I have great respect for, Itumile Musala, all of these people then occupied significant positions elsewhere. And of course, you see, unfortunately, one of the differences that we must understand between Black people and white people is that white people had the opportunity to do the donkey work for some of these things that they are seeing the fruits for. We overnight want to be all leaders in that particular, you know, it's like, why should you become a leader? Why not me? And these are the things that I say, they keep us busy from dealing with the real issues. Yes, Black theology seem to have dwindled. But we must also understand that Black theology has always been, in my words, a guerrilla enterprise. It was never welcome in the university. It was always done in the corners by certain people. And because of the dependency that many Black churches have on the so-called mother church, you know, the white church, for instance, they would be able to pay your minister, they give the contribution. And so to come and speak Black consciousness to a community that is dependent on the white church for its sustenance, I mean, you know already what is the results. There's no way that is going to happen. So in as much as we need the consciousness, it is also important that we have to look and tap into the economy, so that indeed, when we are Black conscious, it is not because we are doing that on someone's account, but that we're doing that because we embody that Black consciousness. It's not only a confession, but it is an embodiment of the philosophy of Black consciousness.
This is the AZAPO Online Political Education Series, a platform where we educate for liberation. We are in conversation with Comrade Professor Rothney S Tshaka. We are talking Resurrection of Blackness from the Dead. You are welcome to engage with us in conversation. You can contribute through the Q&A and write your comments or questions there, and you're more than welcome to also raise your hand so that we can recognize your contribution. And I see the first hand from Mlagu. Let's allow her to make the contribution. If you can just unmute. You would need to unmute there so that you can make your contribution. All right, let's continue. You're really asking us, to get into a covenant with Black people, and that you, as ordained ministers, needed to have entered into this covenant a long time ago. You know, why is it that we are talking about it and not doing it? And I think that's a real question, because, just about every time we speak about Black theology and we speak about, African spirituality, we wonder, where are our own, Black theologians and ministers who are ordained and who understand this Black theology? Why is it that they are not getting into this covenant with Black people and engaging them? To enable people to understand themselves better in the lens of this Black theology.
Tawa, you're right, and that's why I kept on saying earlier, in raising this criticism, I think it would be unfair to say I am not included in that. Now, because indeed we are part and parcel of the problem, and I think it will help us to start these conversations acknowledging that we contribute to the problem as so-called educated and semi-educated people. Now, of course, the issue is to propagate this kind of theology and the dependency, economic dependency. Now, as a person who is having a full-time job at the University of South Africa, I am able to at least speak to these issues in the church that I'm part-time affiliated with. But of course, also I have to speak, like I said, at a level that is not going to make it easier and quicker for people to sort of chuck me out. You have to find ways, and bit by bit, you have to introduce these things. But I think our biggest problem as scholars, as Black theologians, has to do with the fact that we find it difficult to suspend marginal issues that we might have with one another and come together in the interest of a bigger and higher calling, that is the unity, which is going to be the vitality, that is going to push us into the desired direction. So yes, maybe it has become time now that we find ways of once again occupying public space with some of these issues. I mean, you can ask yourself, what has happened to theology, which used to be, something that's very public. You would have it really out there, but nothing has happened of it. We have recently had people feeding congregants snakes and all kinds of nasty things, and you have not had a kind of theological discourse informed by philosophy of Black consciousness and how we approach some of these things. So I want to say, yes, I admit that it has been long overdue, and perhaps this should have been something that is now at different levels now. But of course, it's never too late. We need to find ways of how we take each other's hands and move forward into this direction.
No, thank you. And contribution from Comrade Nelvis.
Thank you, comrades. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Well, look, you've got to forgive me right from the beginning, because I wanted to ask you whether is this not the time that we went beyond Black theology?
Yes.
I'm saying this because my little understanding is that a Black theology was developed as a form of a paradigm where we were saying, it looks like we are defeated. We are a defeated people. It looks like we have lost our people. It looks like our people are somewhere else, but we cannot disown our people. How do we access our people and chain them to an interpretation of a theology that will make them or align them within their liberatory efforts? In other words, I am saying to you, a Black theology seems to me it is a form of if you can't beat them, join them. I am saying to you, to me it seems like Black theology has served its purpose somehow. I don't understand why it is that Black people, African people, always have to chase what white people are doing and then demand a space in what white people are doing. I don't understand why it is that we neglect our own home, because it is there. Our spiritual home is there, but we've neglected it. We have not renovated it, but we have now left our own home, and then we are now fighting for a small space in the homes of other people. Even Black Christology is fighting for whether, as you have said, whether Christ is Black or white. Should it matter really? Because we are Black anyway. Our life is Black. Our condition is Black. We are Black, and our future is Black. Our past was Black, and our present is Black. So why can't scholarship now move into a new paradigm of going to ourselves, finding ourselves, and living within ourselves, and develop within ourselves, and we'll rise and shine? Thank you.
Sure. Comrade Nel, I think you said it very well. In fact, if I was hoping that I was saying that. That's so the question of Black theology and whether it should not move to a next level whereby it begin to intentionally take African theology as a serious conversational partner. I think that time we're supposed to have been there a long time ago. I think our problem, Comrade Nel, is the problem is that in the spaces that I move along, that many people do not want to take the backlash that comes with an assertion that says, I am moving into this direction, whether or not you come with me or not. That's our problem. Secondly, is that we are not taken seriously by white folk. And that's why they are so arrogant in saying Black theology is dead, because they know exactly what happens once you hire out from people who are vocal like Tshaka today, putting them in positions. You know exactly what is the consequence for that. So the idea of not creating our own and begging for inclusion is the idea that had accompanied the origin of Black theology in the USA, is the same idea that had accompanied the origin of Black theology in South Africa. And that's why it's so important that we begin to sort of look at the criticisms that people and colleagues from West and East Africa had said about Black theology. For a very long time, the argument was, you guys are just perpetuating, you're painting this Jesus Black, but you're actually saying nothing about a worldview that has had its own life-giving force, that you intentionally don't work into your reflections about God on the African continent. So there are pockets of work with regard to that. But I think we have to be intentional. If you do something by just doing it for the sake of doing it, it can become a problem. But we have to be intentional in saying Black theology ought to take its African heritage very seriously, its conception of God, as was done by our forefathers who were preserved by a spirituality that makes sense to them in the times when it was most difficult for them, and to tap into those things. You see. And another important point that your reflection made me think of is an African saying that says, you cannot say that your mother's cooking is the best if you have never left your mother's house. Now, many people tend to be very critical when Africans embrace also Christianity, but that comes from a perspective that says that we have never solely insisted radically on one thing. We've always been open to and embracing other forms of truth, and that's why the idea that Africa was discovered is problematic, because Africans saw those people when they arrived. So how can you discover something when we've seen you coming? So I find that many people are quite quick in saying, get rid of these things. And to a great extent, I do agree that unless we're able to really pride ourselves with African worldviews, African cultures, we are not transforming this. But it's also important that we find ways, perhaps a multi-pronged approach to addressing this in the different spaces that we find ourselves occupying.
This is quite an interesting one, Professor Tshaka. A lot of people want to know, really, if you talk of Black consciousness, you know that it has, same values, same, conceptualization of views, and same way of analysis of society. Can we say we have one Christianity, or is there a multiplicity of Christianities out there? Other people are interested in understanding whether there is a difference. How do you interpret the African traditional religion versus the the conceptualization of the Black liberation theory?
Yeah, again, I think that question sometimes assumes that indeed the Christianity that was presented to us was white, and so the question is, where do you belong if indeed you are African and you are Black?
Yeah, Black. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it is problematic when you see it like that. First and foremost, I think it's important that we in dealing with Christianity as a faith that is not devoid of a particular Eurocentric culture. We have to speak also about a history of subjugation and a history of insisting on having the final word. You see, the whole ideas of the solas in the Reformed tradition, sola scriptura, sola fide, so on and so forth, is a way of actually closing itself to all else. And it's very problematic to Africa, for instance. So if you're going to say, I have the last word on Christ, on God, and no one else had experienced God, it is problematic, because you must ask yourself then, Tawa, I ask myself, are you saying that there has been no divine interaction on the African continent before the arrival of Western Christianity? It can't be. You know, we were not frozen in time until this come, but there's an insistence, and this you see not only in Western Christianity, but even in Western scholarship, the need to want to have the final word on what is the truth and whose is the truth. And that's why I made reference to the idea of when Africans speak about, you cannot say your mother's cooking is the best if you have never left your mother's house. So the obsession to want to have the final word on what is the truth is the one that has allowed the many mistakes that Christianity has made over the years. You know, I mean, for instance, you would never in my church, you would never hear me speak ill of the Muslims or of African, because I say, you know, God has got a way of engaging us, and it is not for me to know exactly in what form God does that engagement. You see the tendency of wanting to show God in a particular box and say, here is God, is very problematic, because it creates a number of other problems. Now, if in this discourse we had taken African traditional religion very seriously, we would have known that God is the great spirit in Africa. And spirit has got no form. You see, now Black theology of liberation is a means towards a particular end. And this is so. It was never meant to be a permanent thing. It was simply to say, this is how I relate to God in my own Black situation, until such time that there's no more white hegemonic theologies, perhaps we would not have this conversation. It was a reaction to that particular thing, and that's why I engaged in Black theology. But I see it as a means to a particular end.
I hear you, Comrade Witcher. If you can just unmute and then make a contribution. Witcher, are you there? All right, we can't get hold of her. Okay, now as we move on with the conversation, there's there's a feeling that we have an understanding of the problems and all the, call it the reasons that you give to why we are where we are. And the real question is, how do we then deconstruct the narrative in such a way that we regain Blackness in the church, we regain Blackness in where we operate? Because the fact of the matter is that the South African Council of Churches is run by African people, by Black people. The majority of people who go to church are ministered to by Black people. And the majority of these people who minister to the congregants are people who have an inclination or understanding of what we mean by Black theology. And yet they still continue to perpetuate the narrative of the Western understanding of Christianity. How do we deconstruct this?
Yes. So two things, my Tao. Two things. And the one thing is, I want to go back again to that thing when I say that the struggle today is a struggle over the curriculum. What you put into the curriculum determines the product at the end of the day. And the second thing is, if you look at our forebears, if I were to say, in Black theology as a discipline, you would find that all of these guys who engaged in Black theology developed Black theology along their denominational lines, for instance. Are we together? So you would have Tutu, who's Anglican, you had Busak, who's Reformed, you have Maimela, Lutheran, and so on. So in developing Black theology along those confessional lines, there has not been what I would like to call an overhaul of what is the greater philosophy within that body. If I am a Reformed, what is it that I have done to overhaul Reformedness so that Blackness and Black theology is at least over-encompassing in that? We have not done it in that way. It has been very superficial, in my opinion. That's why it has become so easy that after a certain period, people go back to the establishment and there's no more talk about this, because we have not had a conversation about how the importance of being African and being Reformed, for instance, and finding ways of making this coexist in a way that really justifies my engagement in what is African. We have not done much of that. I mean, you can mention all of them. I mean, from the first generation to the latter part, all of these are within the matrix, and they have would have like a little desk for Black theology there, but it's not overhauling the whole thing. That's a problem. So people transform and say, well, if you want to speak about this, I've got a section where I deal with this issue, but it does not percolate through my whole existence. My way of doing things does not reflect that, and this is my problem with that. We have unfortunately not gotten to a point where, as a discipline and where as like-minded theologians, we get to have a conversation and gave over the baton. I mean, when I speak with some of my guys that I found in theology about Black theology, it's very disappointing in my opinion. It's very, and you see, I do appreciate that there's a difference between confession making and reciting the confession. You understand what I mean? So it was, I understand it was difficult for them then. And so they are the quickest one. They are the very ones who say, but Tshaka, you need to now understand and appreciate that the things are different. Now, this is the problem that I'm having with some of my ancestors in this discipline, and that we have nothing to give really to the generation that is to come. And so, like I said, a university has got a particular function, my brother. Ali Mazrui speak about the university in Africa as a machine that sort of just produces, semi-Europeans and stuff like that. And this is exactly our problem. And that's why I'm saying we have to start by acknowledging that we are part of the problem, whether we are workers in a university or whether we own the university. Because the first thing that most of us do is to make sure that I get the accolades. I get to be recognized, not by Black folk, but by white folk. We have that thing of when a white person says Tshaka, you're on point. You feel like now. But the same does not. And the problem is because we as Blacks, we have not taught ourselves to deliberately take each other seriously. Also as scholars, to read each other's work, to engage one another. And that's why I'm saying we are latecomers to this game. And that is why we get bogged down by issues that says, why should you be the leader? Why can't I be the leader? Unnecessary fights that prevent us from seeing how we are missing opportunities for really pushing this to where it must be.
There's a comment here that we have to stop playing hide and seek with European and Arabic and Jewish spirituality, and our starting point should really be, to reject foreign spiritual knowledge as a lens through which we seek to rebuild our relationship with creation and therefore our spirituality. It's an interesting comment that, the interruption of and underdevelopment of our original spirituality because of colonialism should not be an excuse for our failure to reconnect with and advance our original spirituality. Are we offering excuses?
I think we are. I think we are very much so. And again, I am in the middle of this also. But you see, the thing is, when you look, where I am currently, you realize the force that education has on you. I don't know how to put it really, but education is never neutral. It's never neutral. I think we need to understand that. So we need to start questioning why we read certain things. Why are certain things prescribed for us? And you don't understand this until you find yourself in a situation where you're doing exactly the kinds of things of trying to make an argument where there's not an argument. I think for me, you know, there was a Situlwana who once said, when he was asked, you know, if at all you are so critical of this Christian faith, why don't you just leave it, man? And he said, you know, I'm bewitched by this. I'm trying to say is that the seeds that academic scholarship does, or rather, let me put it this way, the seeds that are implanted into us from the time that we go to school, what we are taught, university, and so forth, we see these things come out in ways that it even befuddles us. You know, let me make an example of arrestation, for instance. You know, when we are taught arrestations at school, without understanding the context, without understanding the words, but being able to say it, because that's the idea, is to say it. And when you sort of deconstruct that at a later stage, you realize what you have been taught, even unconsciously. And these are the things that when you find yourself in a situation where you have to mean or to say something, you fall back on these things because the seeds have now germinated in this. And that's why for me, what we need to really begin to say out loudly and strongly is the struggle over the curriculum today. You know, these ministers in these mainland churches, they could not help themselves. The curriculum dictated, basically, the outcome. And that's why we are the very ones who look down on our African brothers and sisters when they're doing African theology. It is, you know, the whole perceptions that we have as Africans against our own cultures. But that is only as a result of the fact that ours has been wiped out. In fact, we don't remember that well. And so when you don't remember much, you take whatever is given to you, even in the way that is given to you.
You know, I imagine, Comrade Tshaka, you know, going to the Methodist Church and telling them, because Vasco da Gama brought us, you know, this thing as a means of oppressing us. You know, they will chuck you out.
That's why it's important that the truth must be bit by bit. Bit by bit. It's unfortunately like that. But, you know, I've read some things of people saying, well, you know, even if you liberate someone, because they have grown to attach to their own, you know, these chains, they are there even when they are not there. So it's difficult. Yeah. We have to admit we are a broken people. And I think we have to stop these lies that we are forced to buy into of non-racialism and stuff like that, because it is these things, they serve particular people, not Black people. Because once we begin to identify our problem as Black, not you know, people are comfortable to say human rights, but that's not the issue. Because you see, the problem is Blacks were not perceived to be proper human beings. So we have to speak about Black, but not because it makes some people uncomfortable. Not many people will be comfortable for you to speak that. So that's why people say, Rothney, but why can't you just be Black conscious and be not loud about it? Don't make noise about that. Because they don't want to hear that, you see. It reminds them of the privilege that they have. And that's the Black condition is what it is today, is not by God's design. You see, it's a man-made thing. And so people don't want that conversation because it makes them uncomfortable, you know, both in South Africa and elsewhere. Yeah,
you know, I'm sitting here as Simpuaj and listening to all of you saying the kind of things that you say, and I'm saying, well, you're saying, you know, all the nice things, and you're giving, you know, it's all beautiful, and as beautiful as it is very uncomfortable. it is very uncomfortable for the majority of people who go to church in this country. And the real question that we should engage in, as Black people who are conscious, is how do we change the narrative in such a way that people are comfortable with the new narrative, such a way that they are comfortable with, adopting, the new narrative that you want them to adopt. The real question is, what must be done? What should be done to enable the church, to enable people to appreciate their Blackness, to actually redirect their Blackness and look forward to that Blackness?
Sure. So, Tawa, you would have remembered me saying I try to be very careful when I'm in the space of white people, when I criticize everything Black. Even when people are writing this thing of Zuma and stuff like that, I am very conscious of where I am if I were to offer a comment on that, because I don't want to be a reference to white folks. Because I've never believed that white, well, this is just me, and maybe I'm also messed up, that they want really what is to your interest. So it depends where I have this conversation. So when I speak about this in their presence, the issue of comfort has a great to do with privilege. You see, a white person can decide not to hear, to be part of a conversation anymore, but by just walking out of that. Now, Black people we don't have that option. The things that gang up on us Black people are not things that we can decide to just switch off and say, well, because I'm a bit uncomfortable, let me just switch off now. And that's why it's important when we have this conversation as Black folk, we'll have to understand why is it that we are so uncomfortable? What are the issues that make us uncomfortable? Name them.
Yeah.
We name these things.
You see, the problem with this discomfort, it is not amongst white people. It is Black on Black. We are sitting together and we are talking to each other about our condition, about our Blackness, and yet we feel very uncomfortable of changing the narrative, of going to folk and saying, what we have been preaching all along is not the kind of message that you should be receiving. This is a new narrative. That is the real question that we have to grapple with. Let's just discard the existence of white people from the conversation
Sure.
On us as people who are impacted and affected.
Yes. So I think for me, the starting point is to the acknowledgement that what colonialism did and apartheid did to us was to empty us. That shell again that I speak about. And so, of course, you have Biko, using that Fanonian way of looking at the Black situation, that we have become empty. Because you see, have you ever seen Black people when they are really fed up among themselves, speaking about the ills, and then you introduce a white person in their space, and suddenly, as I've said, the conversation changes because the dynamics change. White presence in our spaces. So for me, I think it's important that we as Black folk acknowledge first and foremost where we come from, that this is a fate that was imposed onto us. But in that imposition, we were asked to be the spokespersons of saying everything negative about our own people, our own histories. You can only make place for one ideology if you get rid of what you have. And so in the forms of the heroes that we have, when I read of Tshaka was presented as just this crazy monster who just killed people. That the idea is to contort it in such a way that you become the spokesperson for the very hegemonies. So this is our problem of our Black people, that we don't want to hear anything that reminds us of the fact that we have not all been oppressive. Let me just, as a parting shot, make an example of for someone I preached not so long ago, the idea of Jesus and Pilate saying, here is your king and stuff like, and people are saying, no, but it's not our king. We only have the colon. I can't remember exactly. You see, because I don't read the Bible every day of my life as well. But the idea of we would rather have Caesar than Jesus. It's also an idea that already at that time speak to how important empire has been. That you are comfortable in disowning and disavowing your own, only to accept that which is foreign. That there's some kind of a xenophilia, the love of foreign things at the expense of our own. I mean, just like the idea of a white Jesus. I mean, can you imagine if we have a picture of Jesus that looks like Rothney Tshaka with the nose that I have, and people's like, what the hell? But yet I look like you, but you prefer it to be a blonde, blue-eyed person that is not even part of the Jesus that walked in the Near Eastern time. So that idea of always wanting something that doesn't look like us, and wanting something that is going to save us, but it won't come from ourselves. This is the conversations that we need to have, but we need to have them in such a way that we begin to make people understand why we must have those conversations. This is the last thing that I say. Just last Sunday, sorry, on Friday, we had this, I'm a minister, so we had a sermon, and I made an example of who the greatest sinner was in terms of those who were present at the Lord's table. Judas Iscariot. Now we know, for instance, that the Holy Communion has been used as a stick and a carrot. That if you have been too sinful, you're supposed not to sit and be party to that. And if you have been living good, then you are invited. Yet we have in the person of Judas Iscariot, what is called in Latin, manducatio indignorum, the participation of the unworthy. You see, and these are the things that our people are uncomfortable with, because they have been taught for many years that only certain people are supposed to partake in the Holy Communion. And once you open it up and make an example of Judas at the table, you are now perceived to be contorting this gospel, because it does not resonate with what they have imbibed and what they've internalized for ages. So we have to find ways of how to have that conversation and to name these issues and understand what is the discomfort behind naming these issues.
Professor Tshaka, I think what is clear is that this is not a conversation for 1.5 hours. It's a conversation that should continue beyond this conversation. I think Black people in particular should continue looking at themselves and should continue having this kind of a conversation, so that we can begin to resurrect Blackness. We can begin to resurrect who we are. Because it is only once we understand who we are that we can be able to change the narrative and, redirect, the ship towards, towards what we want as Black people, and towards the kind of religion and spirituality that we can appreciate. And I just want to thank you for your contribution this afternoon, and it's been great. I look forward to more conversations and engagements going forward. It's really been appreciated. Going forward, the coming week will be the 41st anniversary of the founding of the Black Consciousness Movement of Azania. You would remember that the BCMA was the exiled organization that espoused and continued to shape the Black consciousness philosophy and its operations in exile, after a number of BC adherents were forced out of the country, and they got there, regrouped themselves, and founded this organization. So we'll be looking at that. And we have a number of stalwarts of the movement who will be in conversation with us, and we'll be talking about the founding of the exiled BCMA, its retreats and advances. So I look forward to that conversation next weekend, next Sunday at 1 o'clock. So a number of the founders of the BCMA will be here with us, and thank you very much, and have a good afternoon further.
Thank you. So there was a question, Tawa, about maybe sharing some of the articles. I could send you a few that you can just maybe send.
Yeah, please share with us, a few articles so that people can continue the conversation. So, we are not by any means stopping the conversation. We would like this conversation to continue, and we would like people to interact with the subject because it is not a subject for 1.5 hours. It is a subject that is necessary, until such time that we are able to change the status. Thank you very much. And that's where for today, and thank you and goodbye.
Bye, Chawa.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Listen, the struggle was not red. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're prouder, too strong.